everybody. Hey, Jordan, are you there too? You might need to unmute yourself, buddy. While Jordan unmutes himself, I will introduce myself, and thank you guys for coming. My name is Robert Cooper. I'm a security intelligence engineer and the SOC manager here at Anitian. And, oh, it actually looks like I was the one who unmuted him. We've been playing mute games all morning, so
I kept clicking the button as often as I could, but it didn't do me any good.
Well, you owe me a Coke the next time you see me.
All right.
So, I introduced myself. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jordan Wiseman. I'm a senior security intelligence advisor with Anitian, and I've been working in security for 18 years or so now.
Some years. One or two, a couple.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, thanks everybody for coming. This is the Anitian and Anitian Sherlock presentation. It's about SIEMs. We're going to talk about SIEMs. We're going to get actually kind of real about SIEMs for a while. We're going to go over what it is, just in case anybody here isn't too familiar with them. And even if you are familiar, maybe we'll uncover some bits that are still useful. We'll talk about where they go wrong and why they're tremendously misunderstood. Talk a little bit about security operations using them, which is something that we, especially in the Sherlock department here, do. And then Jordan's going to do a bit of unloading about how he likes to see SIEMs when he's an auditor, which he does quite a lot. Sound like a plan?
Let's go.
Sweet, let's do it. So, what is a SIEM? I'm just going to put the poetic version out that a SIEM is a piece of technology that is misunderstanding colliding with reality. A SIEM is a log aggregation platform that allows for robust searching and usually visualization of data. That sounds really simple. You put data into it, you search through it. You can build some pretty graphs to visualize data in a way that we humans really like to see. And that's it, kind of period, full stop, if you listen to vendors and both service providers and SIEM vendors.
It's almost always how it's sold. This is,
Yeah.
You want to see what's going on, you want to get all that kind of stuff, just throw our thing in there, turn it on, and there you go. Look at all the pictures.
The phrase is just go install a SIEM, which doesn't really give the SIEM a lot of room to succeed. Because I'm going to say something possibly kind of brave, and that's that there's nothing wrong with SIEMs as a technology. I think SIEMs have become incredibly maligned, and that's because they have been packaged and sold in ways that they were never meant to succeed at. They are not a plug-and-play application. They are not a trivial service. They are not an easy-to-use anything. They are big. There's lots. So when you talk about it, you have this dream. You have a dream of taking, well, you might have a couple dreams. Maybe your dream is to just be compliant. And a lot of compliance requires some sort of log aggregation. And a SIEM does that very nicely. And maybe you have some better dreams. You have some bigger, more technologically minded, security-related dreams. You want to take and get all that data. You've got just tons of data. You've got data on your workstations, on your firewalls, switches, servers, application logs, system logs, IoT devices. You've got data everywhere. And you want to look through it. You want to figure out what's in it. You want to have actual insight into what's going on in your network. That's what a SIEM does. That's what a SIEM is packaged to do. So you go and get one. And then you have a SIEM. And then you have a SIEM. So SIEMs in that form will suffice for your compliance. You will definitely be able to put your pencil next to the box and check it that says, do you have a SIEM or do you keep your logs?
Yeah, just that one box though.
Yeah. And even then, not necessarily if you're not retaining your logs for the full duration that you need for that compliance framework.
Right.
It doesn't do you any good if you need to keep your logs for 90 days or a year and you've only allocated enough space for 3 weeks because you didn't size things properly.
Right.
Um, yeah. So SIEMs are complicated both to manage and to use. They're massive architectures. They're slow. That's not really an immediately solvable problem. They're noisy and they're really expensive.
Well,
They're expletive expensive.
and Robert, let's stop for a minute and talk about that extreme complexity. So a lot of SIEM vendors will sell you a box that they say, everything's in the one box. You've got searching, you've got indexing, you've got storage, and it's all here. But what they don't often tell you is that contributes directly to the slowness problem.
Right. Well, that definitely does. There are lots of pieces that contribute to the slowness problem. Um, that is definitely one of them. But
But the fact that searching and indexing and all the stuff that SIEM's got to do, especially when you bury it in high volumes of alerts like the 320,000, Windows logon events you talked about there, those
definitely.
boxes can only do so much at a time. You need to scale those things out horizontally really to do that right. And a lot of vendors don't necessarily tell you that out of the box.
Yeah, let's dig right into that because right up front, there is no SIEM box. Um, the closest thing you can get to that, and we're not here for naming and shaming. We'll name a couple of vendors kind of at the end when we mention what we do for our own service platform regarding managed SIEM and that sort of thing. But as far as I'm concerned in this, the SIEM products are all pretty innocent in this because they can't help it. They're big. They take huge amounts of architecture. Any of them take massive either dedicated local resources or cloud resources. It depends on the kind of SIEM you get as far as how you need to scale it. Some of them scale incredibly well and easily if you know how and you have the sources to do it. Some of them scale much more painfully, but they have to scale. You have to scale them in order to accommodate all the data you've got. And scaling is an architectural problem. And an architectural problem, well, it depends on whose architectural problem it is. Is it your architectural problem? If you bought a SIEM and you're not having anybody manage it for you, and you don't have any outside consultation or help, it's your problem. You get to scale that bad boy. Same with using it. How do you use a SIEM? When you get into a SIEM, let's say you've bought your quote unquote SIEM box, you pop it into your network. What then? Like it's not Outlook. It's not a familiar, easy interface of common UI conventions and quickly accessible data points. You usually get dumped into something that is a line. It's like a Google search. And you can kind of furtively type things into it, maybe an IP address or something, and you'll get some results, but you're probably going to get just a gobload results. And that's not going to be tremendously useful. So how do you even use these things? And worse than that, how do you even get data into them? Uh, like the SIEM itself doesn't put data into it. You have to figure out how that ingestion pipeline looks, and that will depend definitely on the type of SIEM you get. Some of them have, I'm not going to say easy pipelines for non-SIEM users, but more straightforward than others. Some of that's by design and some of that isn't. Um, so how do you deal with it?
Well, and it's not just getting the data in, but it goes back to the architecture problem too. Do you have the space to let's say you can transform the data coming into it and you have, the
Yep.
internal expertise to deal with interfacing and all that kind of stuff, or your SIEM is a nice vendor that has lots and lots of plugins and things to help that pipeline, but how do you actually store it all?
Hmm.
A SIEM is one of those systems that immediately helps in that myth that storage is cheap. Everybody hears that hard drives are cheap and all that kind of stuff, but you start needing to throw storage at high volumes at something, especially if it needs to be well-performing storage, and that price tag goes up faster than a lot of IT managers maybe expect or are ready for the pipeline of capital requests for more storage.
Yeah, no, that's a fully great point, which I even kind of glossed over there. One of the first architectural challenges is you have is how do you size your SIEM? Like a SIEM isn't a box that has infinite storage. It has requirements, and those requirements are going to be very, very tightly uh, coupled with the amount of data you're going to be putting into it. How much data are you going to put into it? Well, I mean, how many servers do you have? Okay, what kinds of logs are you going to be taking off of those? Windows event logs, IIS application logs, Linux syslog and audit log, or more. Maybe you haven't thought that far through. Um, not to give too much away right now, but one of the biggest problems that we see is that people don't tend to think that detailed about these sorts of things, and that's the most egregious issue with these. But we're going to get into that in a bit. So yeah, I mean, the first architectural problem you have is sizing a SIEM. It's not trivial. How do you do that? What are your metrics? I mean, you have to do some hard number crunching here. You need to figure out, because it's not actually magic. It is fairly purely the number of events per second times, let's just say, the average size of events that you're going to store. Calculate that out, and then get crunching on the amount of storage you need.
Yeah, and the nice thing about that too is unless you start, if you're not adding new systems, you're talking about your existing environment, that storage prediction is, or storage calculation can give you a linear size and how much storage is going to increase and how much more you'll need over time. It's not one as unpredictable as dealing with user and application storage can be, where you have to, allow for the fact that growth isn't predictable, isn't linear. With your event systems, it pretty much is, as long as you're not adding new systems. Well, right. Well, if you're not adding new systems to it and you don't have, outliers in event volume, like, you're under attack or something like that. But, we can touch on those kind of things a little bit later.
Yeah, and we will. That's actually a very good and overlooked item that SOCs use, which is to actually just monitor the log volume. If you notice a big spike in logs, you might have something going on.
Yep.
So architecturally, how do you solve those problems? Well, I mean, really, you either outsource it or you train up. You get smart, you get educated. Because what you can't do is get one of these and plop it in front of your help desk and say, go to town. That's not going to set anybody up for success at that point. Now, the hardware and architectural needs for these is big. I mean, if you're a small business with,
can be big, yeah,
20 servers, obviously not as big as others, but when you're getting into any sort of mid-size or definitely any sort of large size architecture, you're talking, pretty proper big data problems with pretty proper big data architecture needs. So if you don't want to deal with that, either resource-wise or spending-wise or, administrative training-wise, you should look at outsourcing that out to a cloud provider. And by that, I mean an actual SIEM as a service provider, somebody who's going to run the SIEM either in their own cloud or manage it for you, so that you can take the administrative checkbox off of your list and give that to somebody else. And I would recommend that if you're not willing to invest in the education and training resources for your staff to do that, because there's no way that staffing can cope with that without the proper support.
Well, and it's worth noting too that a lot of those kind of outsourcing vendors, one option, they can manage it for you, or they can help you set it up, help you tune it, and then train your staff and hand off down the road. And if you get to that point, they can always be there as a backup resource or something else. But there's no reason necessarily to jump into that all on your own.
Right. I mean, if you want the entire program to succeed, I would discourage you from jumping into it all on your own without supporting yourself.
Yeah, you need to treat a SIEM. SIEM's not a tool it's a tool, but it's not a simple or more straightforward thing like a firewall or some other security controls. It is itself a complex information system, and it needs to be, planned and project and implemented and maintained and cared for the same way you would a major, customer relationship management system or enterprise resource planning system or
it's a line of business
record or anything. Yeah.
Like it's a core business app in architecture and structure. But it's never treated like that. It's never, it's often the nerds for security, right?
Yeah.
You have 5 of them in a basement, and you give them coffee and pizza sometimes, and that's your support. But
hey, they get pizza?
Well, I mean, you work remotely, so I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, it really is the size and scope of a line of business app, and that's probably a pretty good shortcut for how businesses should think about it, because if you're not treating it, pardon me, like one, you need to reevaluate it, because it's not a fire and forget.
Right.
So, slow. They're slow. Why are they slow? Well, why is anything like this slow? In this case, these are either almost completely or necessarily big data problems.
Yeah.
When you talk about aggregating, the amalgamation of data from hundreds or thousands of sources, some of which could be feeding anywhere from 10 to thousands of events per second individually, and then aggregating that all up and then putting it into databases and then making those databases queryable, running aggregations across them, running scheduled searches, running reports, running alerts. These are big data issues.
Well, yeah,
And big
and
data
it,
issues mean big databases.
yep.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, as a typical sort of practical thing is we're getting to the point of needing, to monitor more security and keep track of more things that are going on. Manufacturers are starting to catch up with that and answer customer requests, right? So Windows is a perfect example. Starting in 2008, Windows Server started logging a lot more and a lot more security relevant things out of the box by default, like
Sure
10
did.
times as many stuff. Well, if all those boxes are setting them up and they've got their fire hose of security events that they're logging locally, and suddenly you pointed at a SIEM, you're hopefully not firing it. Platform has to be able to collect all of that stuff that's being thrown at it. In real time, and not just collect it, but categorize it, analyze it, and do meaningful stuff with that data. And that's true if you're a Linux shop who is successfully and hopefully using SE Linux too. I mean, anybody that's looked at the audit log knows how much actual, logging volume SE Linux can generate on a system that's just
Pretty
not
much
doing
just
a whole
idle.
lot.
Just sits
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
And this is actually one of the primary points for this is that the SIMs are always going to be a big data problem, but one of the best things that you can do, and this goes back into kind of management, care, and feeding, is that just because something gets logged doesn't necessarily mean you need to keep it
Mm.
necessarily. I mean, it depends on the point of the SIM, but if you're looking at this strictly from a security perspective, you might be able to get away with some light to moderately harsh even filtering on those events for what you actually end up storing and putting in the SIM.
Oh, absolutely. Your SIM, if you're
Yeah,
managing it as a major project, it needs to be part of and included in your risk management programs overall, and to the point that your risk program should help identify what it is you care about, what it is you need to keep and pay attention to, and that is the only stuff that really should be getting into your SIM. It's part of that tuning process and part of that reason that primarily that they're just not fire and forget appliances. It's not just an architecture to maintain; it's a
yep.
system that has to be cared for.
We're teetering on the edge of getting ahead of ourselves here because
Oh,
we're going to visit that in very great depth here pretty soon. But yeah, no, that is 100% right. The care and consideration these things need to be successful is immense. Um, Getting a little bit back more to big data problems and big databases, this is another architectural and care and feeding problem, and it takes either outsourcing the the responsibility and the oversight and the hardware and resources, or educating up, learning up, and then dedicating the resources, projecting the amount of growth that you're going to be doing as far as those logs that you have definitely defined rigidly as far as the data you want to keep, so
well,
that you model the growth that you're going to expect.
yeah, and it also means that as a complex system, it's going to have a large database and be dealing with lots of data. It's not a platform that the guys with security skills and specialty alone can probably handle. You're going to need to involve your data warehousing and your database management folks in there. They can understand how to deal with those things and help keep the system and make sure that it's operating effectively for the security guys to get the actual use out of it that they need.
Definitely. And I think the last thing I could say on this, which isn't uh, written here because it's really more of a point I want to talk about, is you need to set expectations.
Mm.
Um, you need to understand that while, let's just take Google for instance, who for all intents and purposes has unlimited resources, both staffing, education, and skill-wise, and hardware resourcing-wise. Obviously, they run a pretty big data problem quite successfully and with very low response times. Now, you could try to do that if you really wanted to, but you're probably not going to do that. So you would do yourself and everybody a very good service at the front by setting the expectation, and maybe even setting, as weird as it might sound, some SLAs for search response times. What is acceptable for when you type in a query of a certain kind of complexity and you get a response? How
Mm.
long should that take? What's acceptable? Um, setting those means that you don't ever go into this expecting to Google the security information in your environment necessarily. Now, if you need that, go for it, but you're going to pay. You're going to pay a lot in hardware and engineering and staffing to be able to do that.
And time.
And time, and definitely time. So I think one of the biggest fighters for slowness of queries, because really everything's going to take a little bit of time to run. There's nothing that's going to come back completely instantaneously, unless maybe you're just searching across like data from the last 30 seconds or something like that. But do yourself a favor and set expectations. And this isn't to say that it's just going to take hours or days or weeks or anything ridiculous like that, but you should disabuse yourself of the notion that you're going to just Google and return, 0.000573 seconds later,
right.
A comprehensive list of thousands of results.
Well, and one thing to point out there more, which again might be getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to it in a couple of slides, but to the tuning aspect, part of setting expectations is also about understanding that while you may not, you may not capture everything now. So it's making sure that your leadership understands that if an event happens or you guys start to detect things or whatever, and we'll get into some of those details later, you may start looking for things at that point, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be able to go back in time and look at lots and lots of stuff depending on what you are not capturing and what you decided was most important when you set the system up. So setting expectations isn't just about how the system performs, it's about what you'll be able to do with it once it's running and how that may change or evolve over time and everything. Your folks need to understand that it doesn't mean it's not useful, it doesn't mean you weren't doing the right thing, it means that the system was targeted for what we needed, and that itself is a moving target. It changes.
Yep. Yeah, it needs to be a purpose-built system.
Right.
All right. So reality and dream 3. Oh, come on. Where's my slide? There we go. Inaccuracy. This really can be translated into they're pretty hard to use. Again, it's not, I don't mean to be a little mean here, but a lot of people aren't even tremendously good at Google. Now, this doesn't hold true for a lot of technical professionals, obviously, but the SIEM consumers might not be the most directly tech-savvy people. So SIEM query languages have everything on Google as far as complexity, robustness, and ridiculousness for how you can put in and try to get data out of them. And keeping in mind that the kinds of data you're typically looking for are very pointed and very specific, because just like in Google, while you could put in dog and get 10 billion trillion results back, you're probably not going to want to manually sift through each and every single one of those if what you're looking for is Welsh Corgi.
Well, and learning how to effectively. Oh yeah, and learning how to effectively narrow those searches, just like with Google, is a acquired and necessary skill for acceptable or for effective use of any SIEM.
Mm-hmm. And that search difficulty feeds and multiplies as it rolls down, because those searches feed the visualizations, which, if we're honest, is usually one of the flashiest things that you see when you're given a SIEM presentation. You get propped up into a dashboard, you go ooh ah as you see lots of ultra hot 3D graphics of graphs over time and correlations, little data points coming in and out of infinity and that sort of thing. And
yeah, for being perfectly honest too, those dashboards are always generated out of perfectly sculpted environments to make it look really great. And yeah. Just like anything else, when you buy the sales pitch for a platform, you have to take some time to make those things actually useful. What you're going to get out of the box is what might be useful in the general case, but how many companies are exactly like every other company, right?
Right. Well, none. I mean, I don't know, Jordan. How many companies have you ever audited that have been the same?
Yeah, 0.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would
maybe negative numbers there.
Yeah.
The same company changes year to year. It's yeah.
They might not even. I mean, companies aren't even the same themselves from year to year necessarily. So, anyway, as far as inaccuracies, the difficulty in using the things, simply using a SIEM, feeds and degrades from everything else, because visualizations and the alerts, those nice alerts that you want. The thing you want, which is that you set up a SIEM, you set it running, and then at, preferably like 11 a.m. on a Tuesday or Wednesday when everybody's bored, you get the alert that bad stuff happened on this server. Here's a bunch of good data points. Off you go. Incident response, heroics, charge of a successful light brigade, and you save the day.
No. In real life, it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning, or worse, 6 o'clock on a Friday night, and it's almost it's an alert that looks incredible and important, and is probably not, at least with the default configuration.
Or
right?
if I'm honest, and from what I've seen from my SIEM evaluations, most often it's actually alerts every single second or minute. Oops, my PowerPoint has done something inappropriate. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, if I'm from what I've evaluated from the past, it's just a continuous stream of alerts. And guess what happens to those? If they're not in Outlook's clutter, they're just getting ignored because they're not meaningful and they're continuous. And continuous alerts get acclimated to your staff.
Well, yeah, and the number one reason that we go out to customers and help them, or we hear complaints about a SIEM, or if we make a recommendation after we do a security, evaluation or a risk assessment, or even a compliance, audit, sometimes we hear from organizations is, oh, well, we don't want to put up a SIEM. It just makes too much noise. It just throws alerts at us. And the answer we always get is, well, that's because you didn't take the time to tune it, because there was, well, you'll see it in 2 slides, but
yeah, I mean, let's dive into it. So how do you realistically solve that? I mean, there's no cheat if you're going to run it yourself. And really, when we're talking about the front end, you have two options. Either you and your staff run it, which means you need to become experts in how to extract data from your SIEM, or you pay another company to perform that duty, but they need to have an understanding also of what they're going to be looking for in your environment.
Right.
Because as we just discussed, we're all pretty special in all of our businesses. So while there are obviously commonalities, antivirus alerts, weird IPS activity, threat list matched sites, those are pretty universal. A break-in on server XYZ123 and your organization means potentially very bad things if that is the finance server containing payroll and whatever else, or maybe slightly less of an emergency if it's lab guy's test box that he just stood up and is getting torn down in 3 minutes. So having an understanding of what you're searching for can't necessarily be outsourced fully. You can build a very sharp relationship with your provider for that, but yeah, you're only to fix inaccuracy, you either have to learn how to use it hard or find people who can and then work with them to figure out how to value your data. So we've been hinting at this all the time. Let's just get to it. What's the real problem with SIEMs and their implementation and running them and having them? It's this. There's no plan. And the plan, such as it is you get a SIEM, you have a SIEM, and that's it. And maybe that's fine. You might have checked your box.
And this is, most of you would be familiar with this. It's a recurring problem with most information technology initiatives in environments that aren't the most mature or organizationally. It's that it's treated as that fire and forget kind of appliance. You get it, you throw it in there, you turn it on, and it will magically do everything you need without needing to plan the architecture, plan its use, tune it, plan the reporting, plan the dashboards, and actually have folks manage it, right?
It's really exactly no different than even a non-next generation firewall. Like, you can use a flat old firewall more effectively if you actually put rules in it, right? I mean, if you actually use it to limit traffic going in and out of your network rather than just putting it in place and making it a fancy NATed router.
Well, and those old firewalls are a perfect example. Back in the days when we didn't have stateful firewalls, you not only had to plan what you were blocking coming in, but you had to plan what you were going to allow back out in order for the connections to work, right?
Are you insinuating we would actually be better served if we got back and we ditched stateful firewalls, because that would actually force organizations to sharply plan their firewalling rule sets?
Absolutely not. It was a convenient example.
I mean, I think there's something in it. I don't personally want to go back to that time, um, but it would force people to address this issue. Uh, SIEMs have to have a plan.
Mm.
It's like your line of business application, which, I mean, your business process owners and everybody involved in the purchase of a line of business app wouldn't just go out and grab one and then plop it down and expect it to start churning out dollar bills.
Well, they
Um,
shouldn't anyway.
well, okay, that's actually very accurate. I shouldn't say that. I would certainly hope that never happens. Um, and you can't do that with a SIEM. You just can't. You can't with any security technology, but SIEMs have been particularly maligned because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, but I'm pretty sure that the industry for a long time had soured very hard on SIEMs because, quote unquote, they didn't work.
Yeah, I mean they were sold and treated like any other piece of security technology. Not that any of them should go in without planning or forethought or whatever, but the idea that it was a single self-contained thing that you could throw on and just your security guys could manage. And I think the industry's kind of realized that, gotten around to the fact that that's not quite true. A lot of the SIEM vendors are still selling, it's we're super simple, we can solve your problems, all that kind of stuff. But everybody's had to admit that it's just not that straightforward, and that's one of the reasons that organizations like Splunk got into the SIEM space and helped to make it, be so successful. There's because they came into it with that understanding, because dealing with big data and needing to handle it over time is what they did really, really well. And that's why other folks like Logarithm and that kind of stuff have got into it and been really successful too. And that's why the traditional SIEM vendors have had to come around to sort of that way of thinking, and most of them are migrating to highly scalable open source technologies for managing data.
Sure. Yep. And I mean, I won't say that there haven't been any advances in SIEM technology over the years, because there certainly have.
Mm.
Um, they've surely become, kind of a little bit more friendly, but uh, that friendliness isn't, in the form of immediate usability. It's just in the form of, I'm just going to say, maybe plausible usability rather than obtuse usability, like some of the really old ones were.
Right. It's a steep
We're
learning
not naming
curve,
and
but
shaming, but yeah,
yeah,
it's a
it's a
steep
steep
learning
learning
curve
curve, but
either
it's
way. But
shorter. Yeah.
yeah, you might have a big, fluffy pad at the bottom of the cliff rather than just a Wile E. Coyote take. Um, yeah, there's no plan. I see this a lot. I see coming into an organization to literally have come in and do a SIEM evaluation. Um, and what happened is that they got a SIEM because they needed one, and they knew they needed something like that, and they threw it up, and they had, sharp people to put it up and get data into it. Uh, and then what happens is that the phrase "just put the data in the SIEM" gets thrown around a lot. And by the end of it, and by that I mean, 9 to 12 months later, what happens is you have a SIEM that's blown way out of the original kind of light scoping for the SIEM project, both size and data-wise. And your SIEM that you just bought, literally just bought in the lifetime of a SIEM, is just crucially, brutally slow and unusable, and your data is a mess. You can't find anything in it,
Right.
because it's a nightmare.
Well, we also see the thing a lot where folks, like somebody like me, comes in as an auditor, and I say, look, in order to comply with, PCI or HIPAA or whatever, you need some way of tracking that information. You need to have, a SIEM, a security alerting system or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so an organization will throw it up to meet that compliance box. And then the SIEM starts sending alerts, trying to do its job without any tuning, configuration, or help, and then it just becomes a nuisance. And so those organizations have this thing to connect the compliance box. They're ignoring all of its noise and its alerts, and it's sitting over in the corner yapping like a little dog, trying to let you know that somebody is beating down the back door. And so the organizations will put it in there, and then they ignore it. They don't see value in it beyond the compliance checkbox, and so they have this resource that they're either unwilling or unable to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it seems kind of obvious that the answer to no plan is plan. Make a plan. Get a plan. But I mean, that's a trivialization of the phrase. You can't just get a plan. A plan is a hard piece of work. Um, and let's just break it down at the root of it. We've hinted at this the whole time, and we've handed out plenty of spoilers. You need to define stuff. You need to take your organization and start defining what you want out of it. You need to define, who's going to own the SIEM, who's going to manage it, who's going to use it, who's going to be responsible for defining it. Do you even know? Do you have a data asset list?
What systems matter? What data
Jordan,
matters? What?
how frequently do people have a data asset inventory?
Um, Almost never, unless the organization has gone down the PCI compliance or ISO compliance or SOC 2 compliance route for a couple of years. And even then, I see a lot of them are poorly maintained, if they even reflect the current environment at all.
Sure. I mean, it's hard work, but a SIEM is hard work, and you need to put the effort into it, organizationally. And honestly, all of the work that you do is good stuff. Data asset inventories feed both, the information that you can extract out of a SIEM, but they also make your auditors happy, and they make,
Right.
many other technical and security processes either doable or trivial at that
Yeah,
point.
and it's a little outside the scope of talking about a SIEM, but when it comes to like maintaining an inventory and asset classification, that kind of stuff, it's hard work to get that set up. But when you integrate it into organizational processes like, procurement and whatever else, it
Yeah,
shouldn't be hard to maintain. But that's that kind of structure and stuff's a lot outside the scope of this. But it's one of those things that it seems trivial and it's no fun and nobody wants to do it because it's detail oriented, but it's crucially important to getting so many other things correct,
and
especially in security.
yeah, and it's not the trickiest thing to maintain. Like
No, it's
really,
just boring.
yeah, it's just boring. So I mean, you got to define that. You've got to define what you want out of it. You need to define, what data you want to put into it and what you want to have, what your expectations are to extract out of it. Sometimes you don't even know that, and that's a process that you need to figure out. Um,
And then once you have those stuff defined,
mhm. Once
you
you find
you
the
have to, yeah.
definitions, you can tweak them at least. And tweaking things and changing things a little bit is easy, but I will tell you what's hard, which is making these things up after you've already implemented everything.
Mm.
Um, Trying to shoehorn in new definitions, like net new definitions, into an existing structure is always more onerous and much more painful than starting off with definitions and implementing them from scratch. Um, there's really no way around that. So yeah, work with definitions, and then once you've defined your stuff, you have answers as far as higher tier stuff. Are you going to be owning and managing this whole thing? Are you going to put it on your own hardware? Are you going to throw it up in a cloud provider?
Do you have the skills needed to do any of that?
Yeah, you have the skills and budget to do all of that, and then you can get cracking on those answers. And not to trivialize the whole thing, because the step between educating your staff and defining things and just having a proper SIEM achieved is a lot of work, but you're on the path at that point to having a viable, usable SIEM that will actually enrich your organization rather than just drag it down. And let's just revisit one of the last points I had in the reality section way at the beginning of this thing. SIEMs are expensive. It's a lot of money to just burn to something that you aren't going to do successfully.
Yeah.
So do everybody a favor and don't half-ass them.
Well, and something to consider along those lines is that a lot, in fact, all that I can think of off the top of my head of the SIEM vendors, whether they're hosted in the cloud, whether you get an on-premise solution or whatever, they generally license by the volume of data coming into it, which means defining that correctly in the first place, in other words, what you're going to grab, what you're going to put into the SIEM, what you really care about, is itself a cost control aspect of the project. It can't be understated.
Mm-hmm. And even if it's not, if the vendor doesn't categorize by data, they categorize essentially by scalability, which means roughly that you could run everything on the smallest iteration and version of that SIEM, but your searches might literally take multiple hours.
Yeah.
And maybe that's fine. Maybe you're really not concerned with having answers within some seconds or minutes, and you want to save some money, so that's okay. But I'm guessing not in real world practice. So that in a nutshell is what we're talking about when we're talking about SIEMs and how misunderstood they are. It's not their fault, just like it's not a firewall's fault that it didn't protect your organization if you didn't do any work to actually set it up. A SIEM's not going to work if you don't give it its just rights as a piece of security technology. Uh, is it going to solve all of your problems and answers? No, of course not. But it can actually achieve that goal of providing you with a point to throw security related data or other data and run, very complicated, very enriching queries and investigations across and drawing conclusions and information from.
Yeah,
And that can
it
be
can
really
help.
useful.
Yeah, it can help you solve lots and lots of problems, but only if you set it up,
Only
in
if you
order
let it.
to do so. Yeah, only if you let it. That's right.
So let's talk really quickly about something that we're pretty passionate here in Sherlock, and I'm going to allow myself about 10 to 15 seconds to do our plug for our own service, which we, as a preview, we do this sort of thing as a managed service platform. But before we get to that, let's talk about security operations. Really quick, when we're talking about security operations using a SIEM as a managed device, or not. Maybe you're going to do this in your own organization. And guess what? As much information and education as just running and managing a SIEM alone takes, add another amount of that for doing actual like threat intelligence, managed detection and response, buzzword, whatever operations, meaning doing security in them, because that takes even more specialization and even more education.
Well,
So
not even the same education when you're talking
no,
about threat intelligence versus managed detection response and threat hunting. Those are all related, but different disciplines.
yeah, I mean, they have to be sharp on how to use the thing. They don't necessarily need to know anything about how to administer one, but they definitely need to have a bit of they've got to have some hats on them of different colors in order to really get full extraction out of that. So when we're talking about security operations, we're talking first and foremost about sources, and we mean sources of different kinds of data. I mean, data from your organization obviously makes up the first layer of that, because without that, you have nothing. You could have all of the threat intelligence in the entire world, and if you have absolutely nothing to correlate it against, then you don't have anything to do. So when you're talking about data, you're really talking about, I mean, the tastiest things are network flows everywhere, in and out of the network to the internet, in between nodes and hosts on the network, as much as everything you can muster, get that network data. And probably one of the other, most useful, but this one's much more obtuse and hard to get, would be file hashes. Because if it's one thing you can get from threat intelligence feeds and IOCs are file hashes of active pieces of malware or discovered IOCs. But extracting those out of an environment in a coordinated way is as much as we've spent 43 minutes talking about how hard SIEMs are, that's an even harder problem.
Well, yeah, and we're approaching the precipice of talking about the pyramid of pain and other threat intel kind of stuff. But the point really is that you need the data about what's going on in your environment. Network data is incredibly valuable. You need system activity data, process activity, all that kind of stuff. But you need that data in order to be able to correlate any threat intel you get with what's going on in your environment, or to ensure that you can be aware of what might be headed your way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and all of that data that you get from sources, internal and threat intelligence, allows you to do the, I think, currently industry darling buzzword of hunting, which just is a fancy way of taking data and sifting through it for a purpose. Um, Security operations should be on the cusp of security news, security
Yeah.
goings on in the world. So they should have a pulse on things that they should be looking for outside
Yeah,
of your
who's doing
normal, yeah,
who's
usual
doing
environment.
what and should they be doing it?
Right. And because that helps them, be a little bit more focused in how they sift through things. So they don't need to just stare at a dashboard waiting for something to happen. They can actually, just like the term implies, they can go hunting. They can go looking for stuff. You do that, after you got your data, You go through and you search, you set up reports and dashboards, and you set up visualizations, and you write queries that you need to understand very well how to write to find that data. And all of that makes up the security operations. That makes up your managed detection and response, or your security operations center. You get alerts based on those because you've set them up using your ability with your searches from the sources of data that you have, and that makes up the security operation.
And it's worth noting that you don't just do that kind of stuff when you set up, the SIEM, for example, in the first place, or set up your SOC. It changes over time based on what you discover through threat intelligence and looking at the data and how your environment changes. I mean, this is an evolving thing, especially when you get to hunting or some of that managed response operations. Something in your environment change, you're trying to figure out what it is, so you need to put in new visualizations and new searches and answer that question. What is this thing that's going on that we haven't seen before, and does it matter?
Yeah, that's a continuous process. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. We get to listen to me shut up for a little while, and we're going to hear. Oh, nope, I'm sorry. Folks, plug time, really quick.
15 to 20 seconds, that's what you said.
No, totally fine. Because I hate plugs, because everybody does. But we do all of the painful bits that we have described here, because that's what we have taken on as an industry. So here in Anitian Sherlock, we deal with this. We have a small selection of SIEMs that we do focus on because they are very specialized. So we can manage SIEMs and set them up for you. We can consult with you, perform that managed detection, response, and security operations. And in the event that that horrible thing does happen, we can help you with the forensics and incident response of it. So I think that was well under, I think we're cutting it. So Jordan, tell us about SIEMs from an audit perspective.
So as an auditor and assessor, there's some things related to SIEMs and why we recommend them all the time, but there's also some things that folks need to keep in mind about the SIEMs that they've implemented. And these are stuff that are related conversations I have with clients and subjects often. The first is the SIEM is your system, for monitoring what's going on in your environment, monitoring security, but you need to monitor the SIEM itself. You need to set up access controls to help enforce things like separation of duties. Generally speaking, it's not a best practice, and it may or may not be a compliance issue for the people who are monitored by a SIEM to also be the same people who manage, administer, access, and control that SIEM.
Do those people get their own SIEM?
Well, they might, and you get into a whole regression problem there, but really what it comes down to is making sure that you've implemented controls so that, let's say, somebody manages a server, and we're not going to talk about insider threat scenario just yet, but what's going on with that server is being reported into the SIEM. At the very least, even if they're responsible for the SIEM itself, they shouldn't have the ability to delete events and records out of the SIEM. That's something that those keys should be held by somebody else. It doesn't necessarily mean they need their own SIEM. It just means you need to ensure that individuals are not able to cover up their own actions, their own issues, or that kind of stuff. They should be working with somebody else to do it. Whether it's a manager that holds those keys, a different member of the team, a different team, based on the size of your organization or whatever, isn't as relevant as it is ensuring that they can't cover their own tracks, so to speak. It's also important for that concept of non-repudiation. If you're going to rely on your SIEM to prove or disprove points or get evidence related to an attack or respond to null hypotheses in the event that you're doing scientific-based event response, all of that's great, but you have to have confidence that you can trust the data that's in the SIEM, which means knowing exactly who did what with that data and who can do what with that data. In fact, controlling access to the logs itself is often a compliance requirement. It's specifically a requirement for PCI, and it is a best practice for lots of other frameworks, including ISO 27002.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that might be, hopefully that's not a tremendously new concept to everybody, but it is something you kind of have to trip across once, where when you've set all of this up for yourself and you suddenly realize this is obviously a key technology that holds the keys to the kingdom, who's auditing
or has keys to the kingdom, yeah. Well, and it's worth noting here that a lot of times in large organizations that have separate security teams, this is almost a no-brainer, because obviously they consume the SIEM and the other teams feed it, and so building those walls or those separations is really simple. In smaller organizations, it's a little more complicated, and those separations need to be built or planned at least as more maybe fine-grained within the system. That gets back to the example I said before, right? You don't want, the IT manager or IT director or whatever necessarily running the SIEM or the systems that feed it or anything, but it's probably reasonable that they're the ones that hold the keys for doing destructive things with that data. That way you can let your sysadmins, run their systems, feed the SIEM, maybe even monitor and use the SIEM, but they won't have the ability to remove things from it once they put into it. That requires somebody else.
Right.
So it's simple things, it's simple concept, and it's a relatively reasonable thing to extend everywhere. We could give a whole webinar on how to do separation of duties in a small environment, but that's just one example.
Are you volunteering?
Sure. It would be a really good, it would be a lot of fun actually, and it would be a valuable thing.
Very, very valuable webinar. All right. Oops.
So yeah. So the next thing, a SIEM can be a huge asset to your compliant efforts. It collects so much security-related data and even sometimes non-security-related data from your environment that if you have the time to tune those reports and those visualizations, your SIEM can automatically provide evidence of the effectiveness of your security controls, that they exist or in place in the first place, that they cover all the systems necessary for whatever your compliance scheme is. And you can use it to automate the generation even of audit artifacts. If you use it to test and monitor your controls, you can use that to show the auditor you're doing it to. A perfect example here is testing the efficacy of, say, a web application firewall or a regular network firewall, or the application of file system level controls or SE Linux. I mean, so that's not one example, that's several. But the point is you set that kind of stuff up, and you've got a control scheme that says these are how we secure this data. We implement these SE Linux policies to ensure that data on those Linux systems are protected, or we've implemented a WAF in front of our website to ensure that attacks against maybe our payment site, or a payment application are going to be filtered and caught and unsuccessful and all that kind of stuff. Well, those things generate the logs that feed into your SIEM that you can use to show the auditor, see, not only do we say we did it, but here's the proof it's in place and actually working. And for most of those systems, you want to generate dashboards or reports in your SIEM so that you can monitor those controls over time anyway. You need to know how many attacks are being blocked, what kinds of attacks are being blocked, how those attacks have changed over time. So you're going to build things into your SIEM to track some of that information, possibly, and that same information is useful to demonstrating, to the auditor. You can hand them the same kind of output from those reports and say, see, look, they're in place, they're effective right there, and we've even modified them over time to respond to changes in the environment, which is something that's required by SOC 2 and PCI, for example. Yep. So a SIEM is a really convenient, easy way to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, very recently even I was assisting, from a managed SIEM perspective, one of our clients who was going through an audit, and we got a list of artifacts that the auditor needed, such as prove to me about the access to the system and who has access to the data. Are you guys doing that from a compliance appropriate environment? Prove to me that the antivirus was even getting updated and that sort of thing. That was a little outside the SIEM, but these are the sorts of artifacts that you need when you're going through an audit, and a SIEM obviously holds just amazing amounts of data and can be very useful for that.
Exactly.
So last point.
The last point is, and this is probably the most commonly overlooked thing when it comes to the SIEM from the audit perspective, and that is whatever the subject of your audit. Let's take PCI as an example, or actually let's take HIPAA as an example. It's kind of related, but the SIEM itself, depending on how much and how detailed of data you're pulling into it, may not just be a control for monitoring the systems. It itself may become a regulated system. SIEMs receive data about lots of activity in your environment. It may contain things like internal addresses for your systems that you're monitoring. It could contain, user account information, usernames, passwords, maybe valuable debug stuff. It could contain, PHI, if we're talking about a HIPAA example. If you're tracking access to a patient system, well, maybe it contains the name, account number, MRN, all just stuff, the medical record number related to that patient. If we go back to the PCI example, maybe you're logging, credit card data, or if we go to a banking example, maybe you're logging, individual transaction information or account information or whatever it is. A lot of that data is meaningful from a security and a monitoring standpoint, but it means that your SIEM contains data that is itself the subject of the regulations that it might be being used to help you comply with. So you need to treat the SIEM accordingly. You need to implement encryption and access controls and firewalls, whatever other yeah, exactly. Patch the SIEM, make sure it stays up to date. All the same controls you implement over the systems that are the target of your regulations may actually apply to your SIEM itself. This is especially true if your SIEM is your log aggregation platform and you ever enable any kind of debugging within your environment. Even for temporary use, the same kind of thing that you would be careful with doing packet captures in your environment, all of that data may apply to your SIEM. Your SIEM itself may in fact contain packet details. So treat it accordingly, make sure you secure it that way. It's one of the things that I see when I'm working with a client doing an audit that comes up as kind of the last minute thing. Hey, you guys did great encrypting, you know, the storage of all the sensitive data at rest, except for your SIEM. Does its storage platform support encryption? Is that something you can do? And that discussion unfortunately comes up often just because it gets overlooked. The SIEM is a security control. People don't necessarily assume that it's also a data storage system, which it is, as we've talked about a lot. Not just data storage, but it stores a lot of data. The other really important aspect here, which is not always a compliance thing, it's more of a security thing, but your SIEM, what your SIEM grabs and what an attacker can see that your SIEM is grabbing is very valuable, not just for what the data that it might contain, but the data that it doesn't contain. If you're not monitoring certain things, then an attacker might know what they can use to move through your network undetected. So preventing access to that SIEM, controlling who can get at that data and see what's actually contained in there is itself one way of hampering a bad actor's ability to move through your environment or indeed further target your environment.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we're fast approaching our time limit. Do you have any other points before we
no, I think
open things up?
I think we've covered most of it for now. We've got a couple of minutes for some questions if there are any.
So please feel free right now to use the chat feature to ask any questions if you'd like. Otherwise, if you think of something later or you just want to chat, give feedback about the webinar, tell Jordan and I that we have wonderful voices, whatever, go ahead and email us at info@Anitian and we will get back to you. Here's our contact for us directly if you are interested in chatting further about security. Otherwise, a couple minutes early, wait a little bit for questions, and I think we can all move on with our mornings, afternoons, evenings, or nights, depending on where you're joining us from. Otherwise, Jordan, it's been a good pleasure. I always like chatting security with you.
Yeah, it's always fun.
Get into some rambly modes, but I think that just shows that we actually kind of love this stuff, which we do.
Well, absolutely, and I want to thank everybody for your time, giving us an hour of your day to listen to us ramble and discuss the security things that we're so passionate about.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't like seeing things maligned, and I think SIEMs have been maligned, and I don't think it's their fault.
Well, they're such a useful tool. You know, getting that planning and getting it to the point where it's effective and is a useful thing in your environment is something worth. I mean, a point worth driving home over and over and over again.
Definitely, and I mean, nothing else does that. I
Right.
mean, there is no other technology out there that competes against SIEMs as a completely separate concept. Pardon me, that allows you to aggregate, search, visualize, alert, etc. on all of your data. No matter what it is, but from a security perspective, certainly that.
Yeah.
Everything else is going to be, vendor locked in. You get management platforms for network infrastructure, let's say, or whatever. But there's just nothing out there that's as complete and source agnostic as a SIEM is. So they're tremendously valuable for high-level security operations.
Well, that reminds me of one key point that we didn't talk about a whole lot related to the data that's available from your SIEM, and that's that a lot of those other systems that people use for gathering data and doing reporting and dashboards or whatever are like business intelligence systems that people generate reports for measuring key performance indicators for their business and their organization. How well are we doing? How profitable are we? How well is this product working? What are our, is our competitive advantage actually, working for us in market A versus market B, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
The SIEM is that for your security program.
Yep.
If you need to be able to generate reports on and get KPIs for showing the value of your security program and demonstrating performance, the SIEM is not the only, but it's one of the major platforms for doing that. Probably, I would say the SIEM itself, and then maybe the source code control systems as far as development and stuff, maybe the pipelining systems for build generation, and then probably whatever your incident response tracking system is, whether it's ticketing or otherwise. Those three things are the primary sources of the KPIs you need to be able to demonstrate the performance from your security system. So not tuning it in the first place is really not helping anybody.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
And with that, we will not keep anybody longer than we have allotted. So everybody, it's 11 o'clock Pacific in Portland. And it's a nice day. Have a good weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Goodbye, everybody.